In a recent Q&A with Brian Froud, we heard Froud excitedly proclaim, "We finally made a character that Jim Henson wanted in the first film. We got it now, in the series." So in honor of Jim Henson's birthday today, September 24th, the real-world background and creation of this character, lore, is what we'll be looking at on today's episode of the Dark Crystal Conjunction. Well, howdy y'all, this is Jason Elgato with the Dark Crystal Conjunction. If you are like me and a Dark Crystal fan, then most likely Jim Henson and Brian Froud are near and dear to your heart, particularly since they are the pillars of the creation of Thra and everything in it, this world we love to explore so much. That is why hearing Brian Froud explain why he is so proud that they were able to bring to life a kind of puppet Jim would have loved to have in the original, but couldn't due to technology, is so special to hear. New York Magazine's Vulture says, quote, "By allowing for the erasure of puppets, green screen also proved useful in creating puppet characters that couldn't be realized in the original film, like Lore, a pile of animated rocks that has a special place in Brian Froud's heart. The shapes and form of that character are precisely what Jim Henson saw when he first came to the landscape I lived in so many years ago," Froud says. "I'm absolutely delighted we've created a character not only true to the spirit of the original film, but true to the spirit of Jim Henson." I first heard this in an SFX Q&A that isn't on YouTube, so I wanted to feature it here, as well as highlight other footage that explains it more. All original footage will be linked to in the description. This includes a clip from the making of documentary of the original 1982 film titled The World of the Dark Crystal, which first aired January 9th, 1983 on PBS, where Jim Henson and Brian Froud talk about what they envisioned for Thra in regards to the mixture of flora and fauna. We can see that as early as 1978 when we take a look at the Crystal pitch booklet for the film, which we have done a whole video on explaining the whole thing and reading it all. But here we read an early Jim Henson and Brian Froud vision for this world of the Dark Crystal. Quote, "In this world, there are no clear lines between the kingdoms of plant and animal. Rocks and roots, weeds and waterfalls, all are aware and, in their various ways, can converse." End quote. As I'll clip a little later, we do see some of this flora and fauna mixture in the film, but it's taken to a whole new level in the Netflix Age of Resistance. So with that, let's dive into the 1983 documentary for some context, followed up by the recent interview with Froud, intercut with a small background of this puppet method he talks about, and concluding with the 1983 documentary again.
When we first started on this project, I wanted to create the world first. I wanted to start with a visual world of what these characters looked like and what the whole place was. Plants, trees, rocks, all of that. Start with that first and then have the story grow. And so that was what we did. You know, we began thinking about this, and about the same time we started thinking about it, I saw some of the work of Brian Froud, and I immediately loved it. I thought it would be the sort of thing that was just right for this particular idea, and his concepts visually were the type of thing that we could translate into 3 dimensions. One of the things that attracted me to it was I felt that these particular creatures that he designed, they were the sort of thing that would easily become a living, breathing creature. And so with that in mind, I went to see Brian.
We both went, "Oh my goodness, what are we going to do now?" Because we knew the enormity of what we needed to do to bring this back to life again. To fit all that work into that short space of time was really
Was
tough.
that daunting when you started? I mean, because Simon Pegg put it, it's like 5 movies, and you see more of the world. There's more characters.
Yes, I mean, and also I think what was interesting that the writers and the director didn't get the memo about what puppets do, because I kept saying they don't do anything. In fact, in the first couple of weeks when we were filming, I was going around and telling them, they say, you know, puppets do nothing. And they would laugh at me, and very quickly they came back to me and said, "You were right, weren't you?" Because they don't do a lot, but because Louis didn't get the memo, he pushed them into to things that we never imagined. There's a great story about David Odell and Jim Henson being on Hampstead Heath, and Jim was explaining about the new film we were going to make, which was Dark Crystal, and saying we were going to have puppets that did everything, things that people had never seen before. And Jim paused for a moment and said, well, except for walking and running, of course. And so that's always the biggest problem. But in this series, you see them do things that we couldn't imagine was possible.
For you, when you're you've come in to design this one, I mean, obviously technology has moved on lots, and we saw a lot of things in that documentary where you had people in blue suits that they could digitally remove. I mean, does that change how you go about designing?
Yes, because originally most of my designs was about how we hid things. Either it was costuming that hid people on the inside or hiding arm rods. There's still an aspect of that. However, we didn't have to do that anymore, because that is the big breakthrough for us, I think, is that we didn't have green screen, and now we do. And so it meant that we could puppeteer from the outside. And so the character you've seen there, the major one we did, was Law. So we've gone back to an old technique, which is Bunraku, Japanese way of puppeteering, where you see the puppeteers.
Traditional Bunraku puppet theatre consists of a chanter, a shamisen player, and 3 puppeteers to control each puppet. UNESCO lists Bunraku as an intangible cultural heritage, along with Japan's other theatrical traditions of kabuki and no. Bunraku's roots lie in Osaka near the end of the 16th century, when joruri, a performing art using chanting and shamisen, was combined with puppet theatre to form a new theatrical art called ningyo joruri. At first, the plays all had historical themes, but in the early 18th century, new tales of romance and everyday life brought a dramatic surge in popularity. Many accomplished authors began contributing plays, and the art developed rapidly. Around this time, the number of puppeteers was increased from 1 to 3 for each puppet. It was in the 19th century that Bunraku acquired its present name, from a famous puppet theatre called the Bunrakuza. In Bunraku, separate puppeteers control the puppet's head and right hand, left hand, and legs.
What it does is actually engages the puppeteer directly to the puppet. And so we get much more dynamic movement, and the creature is much more expressive. And that, I think, to me, is one of the most exciting things. So in our modern technology, we've gone back to something that's really ancient way of puppeteering. And I just want to finish about the Law thing, is that it's wonderful to see it as a character. To see it move and emote. Years ago, Jim Henson came to see me. I live on the edge of Dartmoor, and he fell in love with the landscape, and he said, I want that feeling of this landscape in the film. And we've got some of that in the original Dark Crystal. Bit drier in the film than it is where I am. However, there are these tors, these big mounds of rocks, and Law is based on that. And so we finally made a character that Jim Henson wanted in the first film. We've got it now in this series.
Jim came to visit me in Devon, and we went out for a walk. And there were twisted trees and moss. And he said he wanted the film to feel like this. Jim wanted a rich, organic feeling to the whole film. It's reflected in some of the landscape that surrounds me in Dartmoor. lot of research, did a lot of reading into various religions and philosophies and art forms. We wanted to make these characters alive, to exist in their own world, not just for the very short time that we see them in the movie. We want to know that when we leave them at the end of the film, that they're still living, they still have their own lifestyles.
I like to think of Dark Crystal as sort of a work of art, and it feels to me like it is. But it's not a personal work of art. It's not just something I did, but it's something that, Frank and Brian and Gary and all the performers. So hundreds of people created this thing, and as a work, I think it's something we'll always be happy with. All in all, we spent over 5 years working on the film. It's probably the hardest thing that I've ever worked on. It was the most work, it was the most difficult, but it was the most fun, it was the most rewarding, and of all projects that I've ever worked on, it's the one that I'm the most proud of.
In the Vulture interview that I mentioned earlier, it concludes, quote, "Yet as easy as it is to explain how the puppets work, why they work remains something of a mystery, even to Brian Froud. I think there's something primal about human beings and our desire to invest the inanimate with life, especially things that we assemble and try to give our personality," he says. "Our rational mind tells us it's just made out of stuff, but our emotional body responds to something that seems to move and has a life beyond itself. There is something extraordinary, especially when watching the new series. You don't lose sight, ever, that they are puppets, but they'll do something that catches you unawares because it's emotional and it becomes a magical thing," end quote. Well, on this Jim Henson Day, I think the Netflix series honored his legacy in many, many ways. Let's continue to honor his imaginative work as we continue to explore this wonderful world he created, Thra. Happy birthday, Jim Henson.